Hi. I'm really, really grateful to be here. I don't feel like I did a lot of those things. I feel like other people were doing things, and I sort of like was just a cog in the wheel. So I'm just grateful for this opportunity, and I'll try to accurately reflect everything that all of you have given me directly or indirectly in the next 19 minutes and 30 seconds. So my approach to this presentation was to try to be a little brave and do what maybe Kathy would want and not prepare a lot. And so that's what's going to happen. You're going to see that unfold right now. Most of you, maybe not all of you, because some of you are quite adept practitioners, but most of you have a story right now about why you're here. I have a story about why I'm here. And you've heard all sorts of beautiful stories while you're here. And some of your experiences, even here at this meeting, probably serve to reinforce and validate those stories. And some of your experiences, and I know from people telling me, have disrupted those stories. And whether or not fundamentally who we are beings that need to tell stories, I don't think I can judge, or I don't have no right to judge. But what I can tell you is that from everything I've researched, my guess is most of us have grown up to be storytellers. And the stories we tell determine how we relate to our experience and how we relate to whatever it is that we think of as ourselves. And they determine whether things are going well or not so well. And so I want to talk today about how we choose stories. And hopefully they're beautiful stories, but not always. Though things that are terrifying can be beautiful in their own right. And I want to do that through the lens of just my own experience, because I hear that's the way to do things instead of assuming things about all of you. And I know the most about that, because that was what happened to me. So Wendy already talked about some stuff I forgot about writing to her about my teenage years. But when I finished I was still a teenager, but when I graduated high school, I really wanted to understand the mind. And I thought the best way to do that, like in a communicable, rigorous way, would be to like build a mind. And I really like programming and things like that. So I thought, I'm going to go and learn how to build like a mind. I'm going to go do artificial intelligence. And I applied to and got into a really prestigious computer engineering program at the University of Waterloo. And I wasn't so sure, so I'd applied to humanities programs, but computer engineering offered me a scholarship and humanities didn't. So I was like, oh, I know where I'm wanted. So I went and I did computer engineering for a year. And in that year, I had this beautiful story about being this cool data scientist and programming like essentially data from Star Trek, and in doing so like showing that we understood the nature of representation and interacting in the world and consciousness. And it was this beautiful, wonderful story, and it was super motivating when I started. But the problem was it wasn't true, right? The data from the world, like my lived experience, pushed back. And so I had this beautiful story, but I couldn't reconcile it with my lived experience of feeling totally like meaningless, like engineering was safe, but it wasn't really about the mind, and no one cared about it. Like I didn't have a community, and I'd gone somewhere that was prestigious, but my friends hadn't come with, and so I was isolated. And in hindsight, I think I probably, if I tried, could have qualified for being depressed, but I never got out of bed far enough really towards the end to find out and seek help. But luckily, and I do acknowledge that here, especially in the context of this meeting, I have this wealth of privilege where I was able to just try something else. And I was determined, either not to just live into the story of like a failed computer engineering student. And so I was able to just switch and start looking at a new area of inquiry, one that addressed the failure of my initial story, right? So if my initial story was I was going to build an understanding of what it meant to have awareness and have a mind from the outside in, like build a machine that made a mind and then thereby understand it, and that was a mistake, I should start with the mind, right? That's what I care about. And so I went into psychology and philosophy courses, and psychology is okay, but I loved existentialism. Like I was like, wow, because what's existentialism do? And this is, sorry to philosophers who actually know what existentialism is about, but this is my undergrad take on it. Existentialism is like, it's like your phenomenal experience is what is real, and any inference based on that is dubious at best and should just be avoided. So like, you don't need to worry about the outside world, like just contact what it means to be an aware being, and that's where you're going to find a way through life. And that's like super captivating. It's this beautiful story also, right? I'm gonna learn about the mind by just being in contact with the mind. It's awesome and it's interesting and there's way less workload and and somehow I'm gonna discover some deep truth that's going to still make a difference in the world and a difference for myself, more importantly probably. And that's gonna be awesome. And it was motivating and it was beautiful. And the problem with this story again was it wasn't true for me. And the data pushed back, and I ran into something that much more established people also ran into when they pursued existentialism, which is known as the reef of solipsism, which is the idea that if you take your own experience as primary and deeply distrust any inference that's made that's not directly experienced, you lose the ability, or you have to do a lot of like philosophical gymnastics to acknowledge certain things that you wouldn't want to hold in question, like, do other minds exist? And if you're not sure that other minds exist, how can you develop any sort of moral or ethical framework? You might end up writing a play and declaring that hell is other people because of how annoying it is for your philosophical project. So Sartre did that in No Exit, for those of you who don't get my little philosophy and joke. Yeah. And I wanted something that was like, mostly about me, but also had a potential to sort of affect other people. So that was really deeply dissatisfying. And so like the data pushed back, like my lived experience around what was important wasn't really accessible from this philosophical system for me. And luckily I was also taking psychology classes and that seemed like possibly a middle ground, right? Because psychology at least sort of acknowledges that other minds exist. And more than that, it's interested in looking at what's common across those minds. So built into the project is this idea that if you discover something, it could be for all people, or at least you would try to establish the boundary conditions, for whom it applies. So it is more of a communally oriented project perhaps than my narrow view of existentialism at the time. So that was cool, and I worked for a year as a research assistant because I wanted to like test the data a little because I'd been burned twice before, well, many times before, but those are the two I've talked about here. And eventually I went into an affective neuroscience lab because I wanted to know about like these like arising phenomena and how we try to regulate them and all these things. And I stumbled into a really great situation with a professor named Adam Anderson who didn't care at all about details and really liked the big picture, and that was like me too, though because they're both of us working together, I guess who had to do all the details, but that was important for me to learn. We had this opportunity to do like brain imaging. Like he was known for doing brain imaging in a time when that was pretty new. And I really wanted to learn brain imaging, and so after my master's year, there was an opportunity to do that on a project that was a new collaboration between Adam Anderson and Zindel Siegel, looking at what happens when people start meditating. And this was right kind of in my wheelhouse of like, I want to understand like awareness, well, like every psychology and philosophy student. And I was also the guy in the lab who did yoga, like, as like an exercise program on the side. So like, oh yeah, out of the students, I guess you're the most meditative-y, but actually I didn't have any meditative practice and no particular interest in meditation, but I really wanted to learn fMRI, and it was funded and it's expensive. So I was like, all right, that sounds good. So we went in and I got like, the Cole's Notes is a Canadian thing, like the book synopsis version of meditation. And the first things you read, or I read at the time about meditation, is meditation is about getting rid of the self, right? Like let's get rid of the self, and then the self is the root of all evil, and we're going to find a way to break down the self. And then I'm studying people who are going through mindfulness-based stress reduction. So probably what they're doing is they're learning how to get rid of the self. And that really was an attractive thing to study because at the time we also had really cool emerging and sort of rarely replicated research that we sort of knew what it was like to construct a self in the brain. Right? There's this like medial prefrontal cortical region that eventually became a story about more of like a cortical midline network. And this network was like it didn't care about anything. Like all it cared about is when you made judgments about whether things related to you. It was like the selfish network. So of course, my hypothesis was like people are going to go through mindfulness training, and normally there's like this this whirlpool, this vortex. I've seen a lot of vortex pictures this week, actually. This center of narrative gravity that the philosopher Daniel Dennett described, that's instantiated or somehow underpinned or undergirded by this medial prefrontal cortex region in the brain. And I'm gonna show that region, this activity, is getting like dismantled somehow when people are thinking about themselves after mindfulness training. And then I'm going to explain meditation, and I'll get a job somewhere, and that'll be great. And then I can move on to something else about consciousness. I wasn't particularly interested in contemplative studies, really. And so I had this, and it seemed nice, cut and dried, and I was going to learn fMRI, and it was a beautiful story. Can you guess what the problem with the story was? Yeah, the story wasn't true, right? The data pushed back. So I p-hacked like the crap out of my data set, which means like you run all these different analyses trying to prove your hypotheses. This is before people were like publicly decrying that practice. So that's just like what you did. And I was like, I'm gonna make this medial prefrontal cortex activation disappear. I'm gonna pre-process my data. I'm going to like run different contrasts. I'm going to like play with thresholds, and try as I might, even after meditation training, when people thought about themselves, they still had this sort of conceptual form of self-reference as indicated by this pattern of brain activity. They were still caught in this web of self-evaluation, even when we asked them to like turn it down and just be in the moment while they're in the scanner. I couldn't get rid of it. And you know, that, can I go back a little? You know, that could be cause again for this. It was. But each time this happened, there was a bit of a familiarity. Like, oh yeah, remember when I had a really like strongly held conviction about a beautiful story that turned out not to be true and I suffered? Yeah, this is sort of like those times. Huh, what did I do last time that kind of worked for me? Oh, I had to change my story. I had to actually pay attention to what the data was telling me. And what the data was telling me was that even though I couldn't get this region to turn off, other regions that I was like just ignoring in my working memory and my attention were turning on. And so what was happening in meditation was not the dissolution of a conceptual or evaluative form of the self, but instead people were learning to integrate that experience of conceptual self-evaluation, of narrative, of storytelling, of this is me, this is not me, this is what I'm about. They're learning to integrate that with this chaotic flow of sensory experiences, including sensory experiences that represent the body, right? Both what's happening on the surface of the body and inside the body. And I also couldn't get rid of those activations, and I was like, maybe that's the story. Maybe that's what early meditation training is doing for like community-dwelling adults who do an MBSR class. It's about the self being continuously constructed, and the ingredients in that construction, the recipe is changing. It's not about not having access to a beautiful story about yourself and what you're about. It's qualifying that story with the fact that there's also noise that's not just that story, right? Not just noise, well, it could be noise, but there's some sort of signal that's not just that story, and that changes the global conception of the self, right? It's made up of more than just one thing. And as we continue to do this research and now apply it in sort of emotion provocation situations and looking at people who were actively showing depressive symptoms or people who had recurrent depression, and I owe this whole line of research to Zindel, who really packaged all of this ability to do this kind of research to me, so thank you, sir. We started to see this pattern again. And what we would see is that this pattern of body activation that we all sort of possess, and this pattern of narrative network activation that we seem to default to, right, default mode network, were predictable in how they sort of played together when someone got stressed out. And what happens when people get stressed, and I'm not necessarily talking about the depth even of stress that Tish was talking about, I mean like even watching sad film clips in the scanner, is that they would turn off this sensory component of the construction of the self in the moment, right? They would inhibit sensory intake. They would double down on their beautiful story, even if that was a beautiful story because it was terrible. Because there's comfort in having a known story, right? It's comfortable to feel like you know what's going on. It's really scary to feel like you don't know what's coming through the door. And when we looked at what was really predicting depressive symptoms, for example, we saw that it wasn't how strong this story was, it was whether that story was happening to the exclusion of taking in new information. Right? It was the suppression of the sensory information that was predicting depressive symptoms, not how powerful the self-concept was. So at least for like community-dwelling Westerner secular adults, the project was not about getting rid of the conceptual self. The project was not making the conceptual self the only game in town. And now we've seen this over and over again in better samples with better controls, that this tendency to decide, I don't want to take in any more information because it's enough already, I'm overwhelmed. And I think Sona really touched on this so beautifully yesterday, like this feeling like it's just so much, I can't take it, so I need to protect myself somehow, I need to go back to what's familiar. It's totally understandable, right? We can be compassionate about it because we do it, but it's misguided. Because what happens when you stop taking in new information and you have a very strong story about how something is going wrong? There's no room for that story to change. And so that can happen in how we think about our general lives. It can also happen in our research projects where we think we have to prove this. Like I said I was going to do this in the grant. And what does it mean for me as a scientist if like I've been doing this for 10 years and now the data is telling me something else? It's scary. Maybe no one will want to listen to you anymore. Maybe you won't get another grant. And as I started to sort of like lean into this beautiful story, because this is still just another beautiful story, I realized other people had already been telling this story. They've been telling it, and they've been talking to me and telling it, but it took me a while to like hear it. And Kathy is one of those people. And before, when people were walking into the room, there was a picture of like a bunch of people in a circle, kind of doing a bit of qigong practice. And I was like not in the picture, but I was in that circle. And she was the kind of person where like you're eating dinner, and she's like, "Come on, everyone, let's just go stand over there." And like, "Why, Kathy?" And she's like, "Come on, like just let's see what happens." And my first qigong practice was like that. And she's like, "Now put your hands out like this." And like there's no like theoretical framing. She's like, "And what do you feel?" And I was like, "I don't know." And she's like, "Great." And what she was modeling for me in like a really masterful way that I didn't really get it till like a little while ago was like she was mastering like, can we just be with the uncertainty of like what this is? Like, can you feel anything through your hands? Like, can you just not know whether this is like bogus or real or anything like that and just like take in some kind of sensory experience? And it was like always like that with her, not just her, with other sort of pioneers in the field. And I don't have time or the working memory to name them all. But a lot of those early meditation data sets that were being published to an audience that largely didn't care. Like a lot of our first reviews came back saying like, oh, the analyses are okay, but no one cares, so like rejected. So they were experiencing this like 10 years before me. We're trying to tell this story. That fundamentally, like, our project is not to get the beautiful story right, but to also be open to new information that forces us to change that story if we're willing to like be vulnerable enough to let it. So now, mindfulness is sort of empowered, right? Our beautiful story isn't just like a beautiful story. Maybe it's true. Maybe the world needs this. Or else, like it's like Armageddon or mindfulness. Right? And even more specifically, like in my own little corner of mindfulness, like the body is so wise. If we could just be in the body all the time, we wouldn't make any mistakes. The mind is stupid, the body is wise. Like the body is wise at avoiding tigers, not so much at gambling decisions. Right? Mindfulness is like really, really good for some people, and for some people it puts them in contact with trauma they can't handle right now. Maybe some people don't like the body, maybe they like sounds. Maybe some people like working with ideas more, and that's their access point to taking in new information. So we also have to treasure the motivational beauty, the hopefulness of having a beautiful story. Like, I think we need it, and maybe philosophers or contemplatives will tell me in the end you don't need it, but most of us right now, it feels to me like I need it. Like I need that to do anything. I need to have this story, this sense of meaning, this context that explains who I am in the world. We need it, but it's not all there is. And so if there's any kind of contribution I can give back for everything that I've received that put me on this stage right now, it's to encourage you and also to remind myself, we need to look at what those stories that we're telling are and how that's dictating our actions. But we can't actually even judge whether they're right or wrong because we're already like invested in those stories by examining the stories ourselves. We have to just be open to that data coming back in. And the way the data comes in, I don't think matters that much. Like maybe science will show that it does. Maybe it will show that the body is privileged and thoughts aren't as good or something like that. I personally don't think that will be the case. It's this dynamic of letting it in. And so when I eventually, after some failed attempts, came upon my lab logo, it's supposed to kind of represent that, right? Like the lotus is the beautiful story, but there's still like this facticity. That's another existentialist term. There's like the world out there that's bombarding us with data, and we have to hold both of those things. So, in closing, I wish you all beautiful stories that are motivating, inspiring, and hopeful, and maybe most importantly, that are amenable to change when inevitably the data pushes back. So thank you very much. Thank you.